Thank you. Thanks, Jason, for that introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in Paris. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm the only thing standing between you and a large glass of wine. So, as Jean-Claude Juncker would say, hurry up. So, the UK and France share a love of horse racing, and now more than ever, in the shadow of Brexit, I believe it's important to remember the things that unite rather than divide us. And we're under this whole issue around frustrating globalization and the unequal distribution of the benefits of globalization, which is arguably what caused people to vote the way they did, certainly in the UK. The Americans are another issue entirely, I suspect. But while trade barriers are now going up in many markets, in some sectors, globalization is almost impossible to reverse. And the gambling industry is certainly one of those industries. We've got a number of operators that are UK HQ'd, like Bet365, which are expanding rapidly into emerging markets. And a large number of those companies are now busy establishing positions in the US sports betting sector as that starts to open up. Only this week in the UK, there was another global merger of the Stars Group, Canadian headquartered companies, being bought by Flutter, which is Paddy Power Betfair, which was mentioned earlier, to form a massive global gaming group. So there's a lot of M&A activity and a lot going on. We now have several Asian betting companies sponsoring UK English Premier League football teams. So what they try and do is to use the popularity of English football to influence customers around the world, and that causes real issues in the domestic market with regulators. So between 2017 and 2018, the gross gambling yield in the UK from bets placed online grew 3% to 40% of the total industry. Now, this is an industry online that in some European markets is still not regulated, and in the UK only started to be regulated 5 years ago. So regulators are taking a long time to catch up. The industry is so far ahead of regulation. So that number's inevitably for online going to exceed 50% in the next few years as operators reduce their traditional retail estates, the bookmaker on the street. So with this growth, we've seen an enormous and growing tension between the gambling industry and the communities in which it operates. So in the UK, the reputation of the industry has been under immense pressure, principally because of the bitter fight that you may have been aware of over fixed odds betting terminals. And that was a massive failure by the industry to really tackle something that should have been dealt with. And actually what's not generally understood outside certain groups of people is it was one part of the industry funding a campaign against another part of the industry that it thought was unfairly advantaged, which as a short-term tactical ploy that was going to backfire strategically long-term is hard to beat. But that's what they actually did, unbelievably. That bitter fight resulted, and more recently, with large fines that have been mentioned for marketing code violations. So there's huge calls for greater and greater regulatory restrictions, mandated taxes to fund research, education and treatment, bans on the use of credit cards, possible restrictions on stake sizes, and a real concern, an understandable concern, about the impact of gambling advertising on young people. But the UK is not alone in this growing level of tension between this gambling industry and society. If we quickly scamper around Europe, there's a familiar picture. In the Czech Republic, betting and gambling duty has gone up with the express intention of curbing demand. It's now going to be regulated there in the same way as tobacco and alcohol, with a clear understanding that consumers need to be protected from the products. In Spain, concern about youth gambling has led to a crackdown on advertising, with a total ban on all advertising in all formats under consideration. And in Belgium, a debate about the overlap between gambling and video gaming has resulted in the ban of so-called loot boxes, despite other European jurisdictions, including the UK, not recognising loot boxes as gambling at all. So why are we seeing this rising tide of concern mirrored across multiple European markets? Well, basically, it comes down to a lack of trust. 60% of respondents used to consider back in 2010 that gambling was conducted fairly and could be trusted. That's a UK lens. Last year, that number had fallen to just 34%, but I'm sure if you conducted this data, and the surveys exist in any European market, you would see a similar picture. It's probably just a more extreme chart in the UK because of the press, which we're infamous for. Part of the issue is the transition of the sector online. So regulators just haven't kept pace, and some operators have basically exploited it. It's also the case that online gambling is easier to conceal, leading to lurid claims that the UK is in the grip of a hidden gambling epidemic. And that concern is also fueled by the public health community, which is now targeting the industry in much the same way it did tobacco, looking to increase pricing, restrict the availability of products, and stop the advertising which supports them. So basically, the UK debate comes down to just a short thing. Some people believe it's like alcohol, it's okay in moderation, and others believe it's wicked, it's evil. There's a little bit of social class stuff involved, which is they don't think it's an appropriate way for lower income people to spend their money, but they don't phrase it like that. And others, and they just believe it's like tobacco, people should not use it because there is no low risk or no risk strategy. So that approach sets to shift the burden of responsibility from the individual taking responsibility to the industry and government. Companies are considered untrustworthy, and they don't think the public health community that companies should have any role in developing or implementing solutions or intervention to address gambling-related harm. And that bit I do take issue with, because I think that is a fatally flawed piece of thinking, because the companies should be part of the solution. These are dozens of them. We've got dozens of them. I won't go through them all. But these are just some of the bodies that would fall under the category I've just been talking about. And then they correlate these into poverty, homelessness, mental health, unemployment. So the result is larger and larger estimates for the social and economic damage done by gambling to the UK, with very little discussion of any economic benefit. So that has had a huge impact on regulatory structures. So the UK regulator has fundamentally changed its main objective from promoting a well-run sector to explicitly focusing on harm reduction. Gambling harm is now officially recognised as a health issue, and a lot of highly vocal pressure groups have emerged, such as Gambling with Lives, which has very successfully raised the issue of mental health and suicide in connection with gambling addiction. The industry has begun to move itself, thank goodness, but with admittedly much less speed. A merger between the traditional online and retail gambling trade associations is almost complete, which I encouraged, and some of the larger operators have made moves to address specific points of pressure, such as a voluntary ban on advertising during live sport and a commitment to higher levels of funding for treatment. I'm going to show you 4 ads now. We're going to show the videos. The first 2 are Senet, and they go back 3 years. The next 2 are how one of our funding partners, one of the UK companies, has taken that messaging forward into a very proactive campaign about responsibility. So it shows you how industry can take ownership of this. So we're just going to watch these 4 ads. No!
Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb. Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb.
Whoa, Bad Betty.
Bam Lamb. Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb.
Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb.
If you're betting more than you can afford, it's a bad Betty. So pause for a moment and think again. When the fun stops, stop.
Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb.
Whoa, Bad Betty, Bam Lamb.
Whoa, Bad Betty.
Whoa, Bad Betty.
If you're betting on the football when you're angry or frustrated, it's a bad Betty. So pause for a moment and think again. When the fun stops, stop.
Betting should never get in the way of your enjoyment of sport. That's why I want to introduce you to 3 simple tools. Tools to help you gamble responsibly. Let's take a look. Tool number 1, deposit limits. Tool number 2, cool-off periods. And tool number 3, self-exclusion. So, take advantage of these simple tools. And when the fun stops, stop. Sky Bet. Betting better.
This won't be the first time you've seen this. But Sky Vegas want to make it clear what that message actually means to them. The thing is, Sky Vegas is committed to making sure that spinning the slots is only ever fun. That's why they got a whole bunch of safer gambling tools to help players manage their gameplay. Cause hey, the fun's in the unexpected, not the uncontrollable. That's why I play at Sky Vegas.
Okay, so the third ad is typical British humour and probably takes some explaining. The simple tools in question are 3 almost successful footballers, or views vary. The fourth, who's also a Sky football pundit, had actually I hope the journalists have gone, had a gambling problem, so they didn't use him. So we had sort of a sort of typical British joke, a play on words around the simple tools, okay? But then it shows how they've used that message to be very proactive. Now, what this is all about is trying to get, particularly young men, to stay in control and stop and to be challenged by friends, particularly in what we love is banter in social situations, and it works. It is controversial because a lot of people don't like the word fun. So the word fun is now very controversial because betting isn't supposed to be fun anymore, according to all the public health people. And this is a fundamental mindset issue. So I think the responsibility should sit between the individual retaining control and the regulator and responsible gambling policies ensuring that when they tip over, they stay in control. Others believe it's entirely on the company and it removes personal responsibility. Not a great idea, but that's the way it's going in the UK. So that means we've evolved messaging to get people to set limits, because the practical thing you can do, and you should do, is to make sure that the tools that are in place on all the, should be in place on all the apps, are front and centre. So that's very important, that people set limits, particularly young men, and we get them to think about how much is too much and affordability and all those important things that we also need to do interventions through the algorithms from the company level, but they also need to take charge themselves, and it needs to be a symbiotic relationship between the customer and the company to help them do this. So, what should we do about it? In my view, the gambling industry faces a major existential threat, particularly across Europe, which is currently not addressing. The globalization of the sector now calls for a more integrated and global view of standards and governance. The convergence of product formats from casino, poker to bingo, all under one online brand, means that traditional sector brands, barriers are breaking down, opening up new opportunities for collaboration. Fundamentally, what is required is industry change and not simply more lobbying and PR. So it's not actually a problem of image, it's a problem with the conduct, standards and culture of the industry. So the image of that sector will not improve without a wholesale effort to change how it does business. It's got to include the design of products, including better labelling, but it also must include how the industry engages with its customers, the marketing it uses, the incentives it offers, and the welfare, the true customer welfare the industry demonstrates. So I'm sure it's clear to everyone here that the gambling industry faces a severe test of its license to operate. And of course, that then funds a lot of other things, including the sport we're here to talk about. So we know that the status quo is unsustainable and that decisive business change is necessary to reform the industry and re-establish public trust. Now, I don't mean for this to sound like a counsel of despair, I know that many of the leading players in the industry are taking action to put sustainability strategies at the heart of their business planning. Senior appointments are being made in these global companies to create new roles around responsible gambling and player protection, and stretching goals are being set at a senior leadership level to ensure the agenda is taken seriously. Part of this change is also seeing the welcome, if belated, employment of more women into what has always been a heavily male-dominated industry. So in this context, organisations like Senet, the one I chair, have a central role to play in moving the industry forward. We're currently working on rolling out industry standards for the identification of online markers of harm and harmful play that can be used across the industry, not just by the large organisations that have helped fund it. We conducted in-depth behavioural research last year, which will inform new player messaging campaigns in November. And we are acting as an agent and catalyst to greater industry collaboration and knowledge sharing, which we think is critical to addressing the challenges we face. Thank you for your time.